All right. Well, welcome. Welcome to El Paso Bible Church. We're a little discombobulated this morning because it's our potluck, but welcome. And we're going to be in Exodus at the tail end of Exodus chapter 22. I know our slide says 23. We just discussed that. I'm to be thrown under the bus for that number. But we have a couple verses in 22 that we didn't finish, but the bulk of our time will probably be in 23 unless I get seriously pontificating on Exodus 22, verse 28, which I told you we would continue to talk about today because that's where we ended last week. So if you want to open your Bibles to Exodus 22, you can do that. I encourage people when you come, I don't care, I do care. It would be easier on you in Sunday school and in the service to bring what is a strict translation as opposed to a dynamic translation. In other words, we want words translated and not ideas. The NASB, the NKJV, the ESV, those kinds of things make it a little bit better in terms of the way I teach Scripture. Because we have an issue here, even with my NASB in verse 28, where the same English word is used to translate two very different concepts related to cursing. And we're not talking about using four-letter words. I think I gave you illustrations of what is cursing in the Bible and what isn't. Calling somebody, as my brother used to call us, meanie heads or meanie hats, actually, is not cursing anybody, right? That's an expression of displeasure. But verse 28 says this in my NASB, and you may have something slightly different, but I want to illustrate the point. It says, "You shall not curse God." We all agree that's a bad idea. "Nor curse a ruler of your people." Now in English, of course, that looks like the exact same principle, right? And we've talked about cursing. Cursing, swearing an oath against someone, essentially laying a curse on them, is a fairly serious thing. When you lay yourself under an oath or a curse, you say, "May God strike me dead if I don't do what I say I'm going to do." You should not curse a ruler of your people. Same terminology. "I wish that bozo would fall over dead before he gets done what he says he's going to do." Sound familiar? Yeah. That's not the concept of cursing God, however. Cursing God, that phrase is to render something insignificant, kind of to ridicule, to make somebody feel small, right? One of the most humorous movies I've watched was A Night at the Museum here, and we're talking about this century, not recently, right? And the Owen Wilson character is a little guy like this, little cowboy. He says, "Jed, I don't like to be manhandled. It makes me feel small." And he's this big, in the movie. He is small, right? But God is magnificent. He is omnipresent. He is omniscient. He is omnipotent. He's all of these things. And so in our speech, we need to not treat him insignificantly and treat him as if he is small, as if he is merely even just a human ruler. And so Moses is teaching them, declaring to them, this is what you shall not do. You shall not curse God, make him feel insignificant or make him out to be insignificant. And as a consequence, you shall not lay a curse upon a ruler of your people. Because if the ruler of your people, Hebrews, Israel, is to be laid under a curse, whose job is that? God's, right? Yahweh's. That's his job. That's not your job. Now, explicitly, that's a prohibition within Israel, in my understanding. That is not we talk about the application of universal principles. Why did Israel get a bad ruler? Ever? Why did they end up with a bad ruler in their whole history? Because they disobeyed God, right? Because that wasn't the deal. If you obey God and you walk in my statutes and you do what I say to do, then you'll live long and prosper in the land. You'll have no abortions among your livestock. You'll have big families. You'll live in houses you didn't build. You'll harvest from fields you didn't plant and from vineyards you didn't plant. You'll have plenty of wine. It'll be a great big party your whole life in the land, essentially. Big celebration. But if you don't, this is the consequence. That is up to them. So they get a ruler that is worthy of cursing. They need to look in the mirror a little bit. Now that principle might be worth looking at. You shall not curse a ruler of your people, because if you have a bad one, it's evidence of God's discipline in the land of Israel, specifically having to do with those kings. Well, actually, in this case, there's no kings yet. We'll talk about what God is predicting in the giving of the law. There's no kings yet. In fact, there's not objectively a ruler of the people. God is anticipating that they will not be able to last essentially forever without a bureaucracy, essentially. You're going to have that. But people say this, right, about our current system of representative government. Who possesses authority in our current system of representative government? I think we the people comes up a few times, right? A few times in the history of mankind and the history of the United States. We the people bear authority based on a static document, essentially static. There's amendment possibilities. We've seen it amended. We've seen it amended a few times incorrectly. And far be it for me to say anything other than the Supreme Court has made a lot of mistakes. People treat it like it's literally the God of this country, the Supreme Court, when it comes to constitutional issues. They've made a lot of mistakes. Before they declared slavery illegal, they declared it completely legal. I mean, they have to change their mind pretty frequently. But the general principle is, right, in nations that you do get the government you deserve, essentially, well, at least the government you tolerate. You get the government you tolerate in this case. Now, I would be, it's not a wise idea to go around saying, may God strike so-and-so dead, right? It's like when we talked about this, the imprecatory Psalms. If you pray that God breaks the teeth of the wicked, you might want to put your mouth guard in, because you may not be introspective enough. You may have made a mistake in your assessment of who's wicked and who is not. But it would be unwise to do that. But this is not a prohibition against criticizing a government official or criticizing a representative. We don't have rulers, by the way, in the United States. We have representatives of the authority of we the people based on a static document called the Constitution. So don't go around saying, I wish Joe Biden would drop dead, please. Or Donald Trump, or whoever is going to be elected president in your lifetime at some future date. But that's not a prohibition on criticizing government overreach. Certainly not at the local, county, state level, not just the federal level, okay? Do we understand that? I mean, I don't know that I'd be able to stop most of you anyway. But it's not a prohibition against that. You shall not delay the offering from your harvest and your vintage, your grain and your wine offerings. You shall not delay it. Further detail given later on about how that's supposed to be done. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Now, in this first mention of that principle, there is no mention of the redemption process, but the firstborn is to be dedicated to Yahweh. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. If you've not had livestock in your lifetime, you may not realize what that's doing. You may wonder, well, why not just get it over with? Why let the mother nurse the baby for 7 days? It's for the health of the mother, primarily. among livestock. They get mastitis, essentially an infection of the udder with sheep, oxen, or goats if they're not nursed on or milked out during that time. If these are not dairy animals, they're not used to being milked by hand. Down in East Texas, if you go to the county fairs, frequently, I've never seen this anywhere but East Texas. It may be other places, but in East Texas, they're East Texans. We don't know. But at the county fairs, they have events called wild cow milking. And what they don't mean they went out and got a feral cow, but they get a cow that has never been milked and say, here, boys, go ahead and try to milk that cow. It doesn't go well because cows that haven't been raised with that, raised for that purpose and handled properly don't abide the process. And so they measure. You have to have a few beers in you, I think, to even engage in that kind of competition. So that's the idea, right? You're supposed to sacrifice the firstborn and not the mother. And if you don't allow the newborn to nurse for those 7 days when it comes to livestock, then you're putting the mother's life at risk and all of the future offspring. You shall be holy men to me, set apart. Therefore, you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. So sometimes there are principles, people try to find health principles in the dietary laws, and there may be some. Like, who decided that some of the things people that have you ever watched the original Iron Chef, the one that takes place in Japan? It's very, very flamboyant, extremely flamboyant, massive. Like it looks like I don't know. But some of the things they eat are weird. Almost none of them could Jewish people eat. You kind of wonder, right? And half of it can kill you if you don't prepare it correctly. You can kind of understand there might be some health restrictions in the dietary laws. But this one, he said, you shall be holy men to me. Therefore, you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field. This is supposed to distinguish them from the nations around them. The nations around them were occupying the land under an imminent curse, essentially, right? You remember that the Israelites were not supposed to take the promised land, the land of Canaan, until the sin of the Amorites, I always want to say Amalekites there, but it's the Amorites, was complete, and it took centuries for them to do it. They did not have, it was a good land. It was a land flowing with milk and honey, right? When the Israelites went into it, the Hebrews went into it, they saw that it was a good land, but they weren't specifically and particularly blessed in it. And so when they saw a piece of animal torn to pieces in the field, they said, wow, look, I don't have to kill one of my own animals. This must be from the gods. It's provision. Look. And the Hebrews were not supposed to do that, because what were they blessed with when they entered the land? You will know no lack. You will never lack for wine. You will never lack for grain. You will never lack for livestock. You will never lack in your family if you do what I say. This blessing is contingent on obedience temporally in the land. If they looked at whatever is torn up in the field as blessing from the Lord, what mistake are they making? What are they making God out to be? Remember we talked about cursing God, making him out to be small and insignificant? That God has to bless you by giving you a piece of meat torn apart by wolves and coyotes or dogs? That's not the way that God has blessed his people in his land. Essentially, in my opinion, they are cursing God by that. And God says, you can use that, don't let it go to waste, but throw it to the dogs. So you don't have to waste my blessing feeding your dogs. All right. So now we're at chapter 23. Tammy, see how I did that? We got the majority of the time left. Tammy was saying that I was starting in 22, and I bent the truth there a little bit. But here we are in 23. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. Oh, wait a second. This is why I don't believe in absolute and particular determinism, by the way. Because I don't believe that God has intended for that train to go by right in the middle of our Sunday school lesson every week. But it does. I just blame that on the train company. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. Dr. Fauci, did you engage in gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China? How many times did he say no? Every time. He still says no, somehow or other. How many people have joined with that wicked man in his false witness? Virtually every representative of the entire federal government at this point. Most of the federal law enforcement agencies, which are of questionable provenance anyway. Most all of them. Other than the Border Patrol, by the way. That's explicitly a federal power. What other purpose do you zap a monkey's brain? Have y'all, we're not living in Planet of the Apes, right? Y'all are not worried about chimpanzees taking over the United States? Is that right? I mean, is that a serious concern? Because other than something like that, I don't understand why something called the National Institute of Health is zapping monkey brains to see if they can drive them crazy and insane with psychological pain. There's only wickedness in that experimental process because they're seeing which parts of your brain they can zap. Load you on a cattle car and drive you nuts with psychological pain very inexpensively. Virtual reality headset. 1984 was not supposed to be an instruction manual, people. The National Institute of Health was not supposed to concern itself with torture. Does that make sense? Like, y'all know the quote, right? The Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war. The Ministry of Health concerns itself with torture. That's not health. Remember, these are principles of God's character that are supposed to be reflected in the government of a nation. There are particular elements that were particularly true in the context of Israel, but would it be okay for me to say that it's not a good idea to join with people in a false report as a malicious witness? I think so. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil. Or many men, it says. The men get hit on the chin on this one, right? There's no men/women here. So unenlightened. Everyone complains about certain things being only men only in the Old Testament law, but here we go. You shall not follow the men. If you follow the women doing evil, that's cool. It's not misogyny, it's just the way they spoke, right? You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. So there's three principles really there. We'll get to the third one in a minute. Recently, several people died down in Houston at the was something to do with Astro. It was a concert, some rapper there. And it came out that somebody was going around stabbing people in the neck with fentanyl. And that may have had something to do with that situation, which it could. If you didn't die fast, you were going to die slow of other things. And everyone's horrified, right, that people are wandering around a concert stabbing people with a needle without their knowledge or consent. Right? Right? But they're not horrified by their federal government that says the businesses are to mandate that be done. Because 8 people died. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil. It doesn't matter that was in El Paso have 80% vaccination compliance. You don't force people against their consent to have a needle jabbed in them. Or that makes you evil. Sorry, people talk about the Bible not being relevant or applicable. I think that's bunk. Nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice. Rittenhouse trial, anybody? You're turning aside people testifying. Have you watched any part of that? If I was the judge, I would clap the prosecutor in the brig. He would be in jail for the rest of his life because of the violation that he's committing against his oath that he took to be licensed to practice law. Shall not do that. If he's acquitted, are they gonna riot? Yes. Yes, and the government has explicit responsibility to deal with people who are rioting. That's kind of what caused this problem in the first place, didn't it? The government didn't deal with the rioting. Verse 3 says this, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. In other words, if a poor man is evil, you treat him equally. If an oppressed man, we could translate it that way, is evil, his punishment is the same because he's done the same thing. Because in just judicial situations, we don't take into account anything other than the action, not the intent. So if a poor man kills somebody, you don't let him off because he was on food stamps, or because he had more melanin in his skin, or because he was stupid enough to take too many drugs. You know how that works, right? Well, he was in poverty. He took drugs, so he had to get drugs, so he had to kill somebody because he was poor. So we need to give him more money. We don't need to put him in prison for life or capital punishment. The law that reflects God's character is that a poor man or a rich man who do the same things get the same punishment. 3 principles. Shall not participate in evil simply because somebody's doing evil, and there's a lot of them. Nor will you testify in a dispute to pervert justice simply because there are many people who are testifying one thing or another. You don't just agree with them because it's personally or financially costly to stand against a multitude of false witnesses perverting justice. And don't be partial because of somebody's oppressed status. They didn't say he's not poor. They didn't say he's not been subject to other issues in his life. He said, but you shall not be partial. Verse 4, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. Maybe y'all don't understand the difficulty with this, right? So I've heard people apply it. So if you see somebody's money clip on the ground, you pick it up, right? If you see somebody drop it on the ground, you hand it back to them. That is not quite the same effort that's required of catching somebody's ox, right? You're supposed to go out of your way to catch even your enemy's ox or his donkey. If it's wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. It's a substantial amount of effort. Maybe y'all have never had the privilege of having a stray goat show up in your yard. I have. Well, not in my yard, actually. So in my neighborhood, this is odd. I am a substantial minority in my neighborhood, but I'm the only one with goats. Speaking of the other minority that I'm in, I'm the only one with goats, and so this stray goat showed up in my neighbor's yard. Big goat, big horns, slightly aggressive. All of a sudden, all my neighbors are coming to my house. Your goat got out. That is not my goat. That is not my goat. That is not my goat, I said to 10 neighbors at least. So me and Thaddeus, I think Micah, did you help us go catch the goat? So the 3 of us are out there like a bunch of chuckleheads trying to catch a goat that is not ours. And where I'm from, calling somebody a goat roper is a pretty substantial insult. But I am, in fact, literally a goat roper. Caught the goat and brought it home. I tried very hard to return that goat from whence it came, but nobody came for it. But it would be hard, right, to go through all that effort. It took us several days, as a matter of fact, several evenings, chasing the dumb thing around, trying to catch it. Even for your enemy within the Hebrew nation, because they were cousins, they were family, particularly, all trying to pursue life and obedience and abundance in the land together. You're supposed to return it to him. See the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless under its load. You shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him. This isn't just to decide. You've seen the signs on social media when somebody leaves their lapdog in the truck for 10 minutes with the air conditioner running. Please don't break my window. The air conditioning is running and the dog doesn't like to go in the store anyway, that kind of thing. The presupposition here is that the enemy is trying to get the load off the donkey here. He's trying to, and you're supposed to, that's the surely you shall release it with him. He's trying to do this and you're supposed to help him, whether you like it or not. So y'all are wondering how this applies to you. Do you not have enemies? I think it was Churchill who said, you have enemies? Good. That means you stood up for something at least once in your life. I tend to agree with him. If you don't have somebody who is not, at least not your friend, you probably need to grow a little more spine, a little more backbone. But you have an obligation, a human obligation to other humans to assist for the sake of God's character, of nothing else. You shall not pervert justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. In other words, you have a friend who is a poor man, and you're not going to change your testimony as a third party in order to benefit him. You tell the truth. You don't pervert justice. Keep far from a false charge, verse 7, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. In other words, within the nation of Israel, you're not going to get away. God is the judge. So you think you're going to spare one person by bearing false testimony against the innocent, and that's not going to happen. Shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. Shall not take a bribe. Follow the money, we say. And then finally, you shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt. Treat them fairly. Any questions or comments so far? Any accusations of heresy? Snide remarks? Do you know how many people under 25 we have in here, and we just don't get a snide remark out of them once? Really, y'all are falling down. I mean, y'all have a real reputation to uphold here. That's okay. All right, so verse 10 transitions from property rights to national observances, right? Well, it's a little bit overlap with property rights. You shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield, but on the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. This is where it's important to remember that the Sabbath as a command for the church is not repeated in any way. And so this is part of the Sabbath principle. The Sabbath is not merely you shall rest on the seventh day, but there was this principle of the seventh year. We've had the slave released in the seventh year. We've had the Sabbaths we haven't seen the year of Jubilee yet, but we will see that. The Sabbath of Sabbaths on the 50th year. All the same essential principle. And again, you have people saying all sorts of justification for why this is true, because God wanted them to fertilize the land and let it lie fallow, and that may have been a benefit. But the explicit benefit was that not only does the land lie fallow, but that the poor experience 1 year of abundance in the land. And the beast of the field experiences that abundance, and you don't harvest it that year. All the rest of the year, they were allowed to take the leavings and the gleanings in the fields and the vineyards. But the seventh year, they were to eat abundantly, because the seventh year was supposed to be a celebration in the land for everybody. Does that make sense? Yeah, Becky?
So it doesn't mean they didn't plant for the seventh year. It means they didn't harvest.
That's correct. I mean, now it may have been volunteers. Yeah, so Becky's commenting that it means that it doesn't mean that they didn't plant, but that they didn't harvest. Now, of course, with the vineyards and the olives, those are perennial producers, olives potentially for centuries. So no, you wouldn't need to replant your olives in order to have a harvest there, or the vineyard, although you may need to prune them. Grapes are kind of finicky. I like that. But certainly with manual harvesting methods, even if they didn't plant, they would have substantial amounts of volunteers growing. I don't know if I have personally chopped a little sugar cane manually with my hands, and if you do that, you leave stuff in the field. If you take a ripe seed head on a grass crop, which is what wheat is, it's basically grass, you end up leaving a lot in the ground. So you may not have the same harvest that you would have if you harvested it and took it into the threshing floor and did all that. But you're going to have some seed left. So it may have been that it lied fallow and they have volunteers. I'm expecting a whole bunch of potatoes to spring up in my front yard because I did not harvest them last spring, and they all stayed in a trench in the ground. So I guess we'll find out. But that happens. Right? We have tomato plants that spring up randomly all over our yard because we mulch with them. So that at the very least, that's what we're looking at, is that there's enough volunteers in the fields that there's something for the animals to eat. That makes sense. Like, you've seen the combines. Have y'all driven through the Midwest when they're harvesting at all? The combines are as wide as this building. And when they get done, there is nothing. I mean, there might be like one stalk and 1,000 acres. But when you harvest by hand, it's not like that. They don't get everything. Anyway, they're supposed to leave it. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry. Is that an idea anyway? Right. Lying fallow just meant that they weren't harvesting it. Yeah. And there is a principle, right? Y'all learned about George Washington Carver in elementary school, maybe? The guy who developed all the peanut stuff. Well, the idea with growing the peanuts was that it's a legume crop, and you would plant it in between succession plantings, and it was a nitrogen fixer, and they would do that. And people explain this passage like that. Like, you're supposed to leave all that organic material in the soil, and it's supposed to do that, but it explicitly states its purpose. It wasn't fertilization or fertility. Certainly, God had supernaturally promised that the land was going to be fertile, right? So it may have had that advantage, but it wasn't that the land wasn't getting harvested. It was that the poor people and the animals were harvesting it, right? So that's the purpose that stayed in the text. So we shouldn't stray from the text and start inserting purpose, divine purpose that is already stated there. Now, verse 12 says, 6 days you are to do your work. On the seventh day you shall cease from labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female slave as well as your stranger may refresh themselves. Remember, the Sabbath was not repeated as a command for the church. You have almost all of the at least all of the Ten Commandments, a lot of the Ten Commandments, all of them except for one, repeated in some manner in the New Testament, right? You have, they're usually expanded, right? Thou shalt not steal becomes, let him who steals steal no longer, but rather let him work with his hands that he may have to share with those in need. The Sabbath is not repeated. However, the principle is that most of your days, we're backing it up, right? We're not saying you have to take every seventh day off. Most of your days, in order to live a fulfilled, blessed life, should be spent productively. Yes? Is that relevant to our day? How many businesses are not hiring in El Paso right now? Zero. Almost all of them are hiring. I forget. Is it in most of the European Union? How many weeks off paid is it a year? Like 6 or 8 or something like crazy. Plus paternity leave of how many months? Paternity leave, as if you're the one that gave birth, guys. Now in Europe, maybe the guys do give. I don't know. Whatever. You have to follow the science until it comes to sexual propagation of mammals. Then that's no longer science. That's ridiculous. Your father doesn't determine your gender. Your feelings determine your gender. That's a joke, by the way. That's not. Most of our days should be spent productively, recognizing that the time is short in this life. Now, concerning everything which I have said to you, be on your guard, and do not mention the name of other gods, nor let them be heard from your mouth. Don't make God small. God doesn't need the help of your pantheon. Right? We talked about that in Daniel. What was Nebuchadnezzar doing when he worshiped God? He may have been adding him to the top of the heap of the other gods, to a point. To a point. We see him being brought low, right, in there. You don't share his glory. Oh, man. We got 3 minutes. Any comments up to that point? Some people get pretty irritable about the Sabbath idea. In fact, I have people occasionally when the season is really busy, I have Sabbatarians tell me that I shouldn't be doing bee removals on Saturday. They find out I'm a pastor, and all of a sudden, I am anathema. Pastor anathema. At least they've identified the Sabbath correctly, right? The Sabbath is the 7th day. The Lord's Day is the first day. But then you have people who don't understand what the Sabbath is that consider today to be the Sabbath, a spiritual Sabbath. One of my professors, it was something I learned a long time ago, but recently in one of my classes, he said, there is no such thing as spiritual language. It's just language. It's not spiritual language. So you don't spiritualize the meaning of a word. Sabbath means Sabbath. All right. So I think we're going to stop there. Tammy, it may still say Exodus 23 next time, but we could say Exodus 23:14. All right? So if I don't get it right, this is how disorganized I am. I just go until I run out of time when it comes to Sunday school. But if we don't, any comments? Any questions? Okay. The bread turned out fine. Y'all don't understand that comment. My son signed up to bring what's called monkey bread to the potluck this Sunday. He did not possess flour in his house, and so he brought unbaked bread to the potluck. That is, if we were Catholic, it might be at least a venial sin to do that, right? It's not according to his father's wisdom. At very least, it's a violation of multiple proverbs. However, the Lord has blessed his foolishness in spite of his foolishness anyway. Now, there's probably a law about bringing unbaked bread to a potluck sign. All right, Micah. Yes, sir.
That goat is not the first time that people have misidentified animals and imputed their ownership to us.
Oh, yeah? Who else?
Mom had you and I catch chickens for some random neighbor who she thought they were ours.
Oh, that's right.
It was actually closer to their house
That's right.
than they were. And I was like, oh, Mom, why are we catching these? They're not our chickens and not our kind of our neighbor like this house.
That's true. So the stray goat was not the first time people have misassigned ownership of livestock to us. There were some chickens. Purportedly, I have neighbors that raise fighting chickens, and they're very different from the chickens I raise, and so it should be very obvious which ones are ours, but it wasn't.
And Mom still made us catch mice to this day.
Your mother, she's a totalitarian. She doesn't put up with, yeah, I know, no, I know. Imagine that. Okay, any relevant comments? All right, yes, sir. Is it Marcos? Yes, sir, yes. Marco, okay.
Yeah, we're talking about the Sabbath. Sometimes people still can't discern. You know, they think Sabbath is Saturday or Sunday. These are words of alchemy. Saturn, the sun. Sabbath is cold, completely theme. It's a spiritual theme. We can say Sunday is the Sabbath because it's 7 day, Monday's the first, but it seems relevant still in a sense of line.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following you there, Marco, but it may be because I can't hear you very well.
It's because we were saying sometimes, you know, making sense of words.
Right.
Sometimes the people say the Sabbath is Saturday or Sunday, argue about that, but Saturday and Sunday, there's no Sabbath in there. Saturday, these are words of alchemy. Saturday's for Saturn.
Yeah. Well, actually, Sabbath is a transliteration of the Hebrew word Shabbat, so it's as close as we get. But we do use the Old Norse terms for days, which is interesting. I've always found that interesting. Yeah. But the main issue was that we need to understand what the law is, because sometimes we flip this on its head and we're out of time. The law was a limitation, generally, compared to the laws of the pagan nations. The pagan nations made their servants and slaves and their children and everybody else work for 7 days, 24/7 around the clock. And then they sacrificed them to Molech, right? And the law of Moses says, you shall work for 6 days. You, your son, your slave, everybody, the stranger in your land shall not be forced to work on the Sabbath. A little limitation. Our culture tends to flip it on its ear and say, well, 6 days sounds like too much. How about we make a full-time job 2.5 days, or 3 days, or 4 days, or whatever. All sorts of propositions that I've heard. So anyway, but we're out of time. So if we want to talk about this some more, you can send me an email or we'll come back to it next Sunday. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the continuity of your character that is expressed in it. Father, we thank you for these truths that are intended directly, of course, for your nation Israel, but also to demonstrate your character to those who have it preserved in your word. Father, and it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.